Hello and welcome. Today we're going to read Mr. Bump by Roger Hangrews. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he would bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? You might bump right into that pole right there. I bet ya. Bump! Sure enough, he did. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there he could not help those little accidents. It's a nice house. There's the house, the pathway, bushes. All in all, very nice. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. I must fix that before it falls off, thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. A very long ladder indeed. Takes up the entire page. Mr. Bump walked up to the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. He smashed a lot of windows. I'd say that's the bathroom window. Or bedroom window, should I say. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost or broken, or splintered, or chipped, or snapped, or cracked, or turned, or burst, or wrenched, or crunched, or split, or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. Poor fella. He can't help having them accidents. For instance, when Mr. Bump works on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilled the milk which he was carrying from the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. Oh dear, it's a big mess. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hands stuck in a pillar box, and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come set him free. Who sticks their hand in a post box? For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. I'd like to go on the bus and not have to pay for my journey though. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time and the nail hardly at all. That's really gonna hurt. Look, now it's just been bent. I wonder what he was trying to do. In order to recover from these series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So off he set to the station to catch a train to the seaside. I wonder what that could be. A little button? Dunno. While Mr. Bump was on a holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea and the lifeboat had to come to rescue him. Very clumsy. Very, very clumsy. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket, and as he couldn't get it off, he's had to walk around it with it on his foot for hours. It's got to hurt. Just having your foot wedged in a bucket. Ooh. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach. He walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all this little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he could do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had, an absolutely splendid idea. There he is, stuck in the big hole. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. That'd be a useful thing if he bumps into them trees. All them apples just fall onto the ground. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use the ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about, and before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. I told you it's a good idea to do that. And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? And there he is, catching the apple. And that's all for now. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a good day. Bye.